The year was 1953. Across America, the sound of V8 engines echoed from factory floors to drag strips. Cadillac had already proven that overhead valve V8s were the future. Oldsmobile had joined the fight. Chrysler was preparing its mighty Hemi. Every major automaker was chasing more horsepower, higher RPM, and bigger headlines. The automotive landscape was changing faster than anyone could have predicted. World War II had ended less than a decade earlier. American manufacturing prowess, once focused on building tanks and aircraft, had pivoted entirely to consumer goods. Families had money to spend. The interstate highway system was being planned. Suburbia was expanding, and Americans wanted cars that reflected their newfound prosperity. Chrome, power, style, prestige, every manufacturer fought for market share. But deep inside Buick, a completely different idea was taking shape. It didn't look like the competition. It didn't breathe like the competition. In fact, most engineers who saw the blueprints thought it was backwards. Some called it innovative. Others called it insane. A few veteran engine designers at competing companies reportedly laughed when they first heard the specifications. Tiny valves, nearly vertical orientation, restricted airflow by design. It violated everything conventional wisdom taught about building a modern overhead valve V8. And yet, what almost nobody knows is that this strange-looking engine would become one of the most feared torque monsters of the 1950s and 1960s. It launched massive Buicks off the line with effortless force, dominated drag racing, powered luxury cruisers, and built a reputation so legendary that hot rodders still chase them today. Then, almost overnight, it disappeared. Not because it was weak, not because customers hated it, but because the very design that made it famous eventually became impossible to save. This is the real story of Buick's Nailhead V8. Most people know it by its nickname. Few understand how it earned it. When Buick engineers began developing their first overhead valve V8 after World War II, they weren't trying to copy Cadillac. They wanted something uniquely Buick. Chief engineer Joe Turley and his team focused on one goal above everything else: torque. Not peak horsepower at redline, not racing credentials, not magazine bragging rights, just pure relentless, low RPM torque. America in the early 1950s loved big, heavy cars. Families expected smooth acceleration without screaming engines. Buick customers weren't looking for race cars. They wanted effortless power that could move 2 tons of steel with barely a whisper from the throttle. These were doctors, lawyers, business executives, and successful families. They valued refinement. They expected reliability. They wanted their Buick to feel special without feeling aggressive. The answer was an engine unlike anything Detroit had ever seen. Instead of using large intake and exhaust valves set at wide angles, like most overhead valve engines, Buick engineers placed both valves almost vertically. The included valve angle was only about 25 degrees, dramatically narrower than the 45 to 90 degrees common in other designs. The valves themselves were relatively small compared to the bore size. On the original 322, intake valves measured just 1.75 inches in diameter. Exhaust valves were even smaller at approximately 1.375 inches. For comparison, Chevrolet's small block V8, introduced in 1955, used 1.94-inch intake valves in a smaller bore. Chrysler's Hemi featured massive valves arranged in hemispherical combustion chambers for maximum flow. Buick went the opposite direction entirely. Looking at the cylinder head, the valve stems resembled tiny nails sticking straight out of a block of wood. The nickname practically invented itself, the Nailhead. But there was a problem. Those tiny valves looked like they should choke the engine at higher RPM. Every textbook suggested bigger valves meant better airflow. Better airflow meant more horsepower. Engineering students were taught this principle from day one. Competitions were won by whoever moved the most air. Racing success depended on breathing. Buick ignored the textbooks. Their first production version displaced 322 cubic inches using a 4.00-inch bore and a 3.20-inch stroke. Compression ratios ranged from around 8.5:1 to over 10:1, depending on the model year. Early versions produced roughly 188 horsepower, later climbing beyond 236 horsepower. Those numbers looked respectable. The torque numbers were what shocked everyone. More than 300 pound-feet arrived low in the RPM range. Drivers barely had to press the accelerator before the heavy Buicks surged forward. One test driver reportedly joked, "It pulls like a diesel wearing a tuxedo." Another described it as the feeling of being pushed by an invisible hand. That wasn't an accident. The small valves created extremely high mixture velocity. Instead of maximizing airflow at high engine speeds, Buick optimized cylinder filling at lower RPM where everyday drivers spent almost all their time. Think of placing your thumb over the end of a garden hose. The opening becomes smaller, but the water shoots out much faster. The Nailhead worked on a similar principle. The restricted valve area forced incoming air and fuel to accelerate dramatically. This high-velocity mixture filled the cylinders more completely at moderate engine speeds. Better cylinder filling meant stronger combustion events. Stronger combustion meant more torque. Physics, not magic. But it felt like magic from behind the wheel. It sacrificed breathing at high RPM to create incredible cylinder filling where it mattered most. And customers loved it. Sales climbed rapidly. By the mid-1950s, Buick had become one of General Motors' strongest divisions, often outselling every brand except Chevrolet and Ford. The Nailhead powered everything from the Special to the Roadmaster. Quiet, smooth, effortlessly strong. Families bought Buicks expecting luxury. They got luxury with a hidden sledgehammer under the hood. But the horsepower wars were just getting started. America became obsessed with speed. Chevrolet introduced the legendary small block V8 in 1955. Chrysler's firepower Hemi kept growing stronger. Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Ford, and Mercury all entered the battle. Suddenly, torque alone wasn't enough. Horsepower numbers sold magazines. Horsepower won races. Horsepower made headlines. Teenagers didn't ask about torque curves. They asked, how much horsepower? Dealerships posted performance figures on window stickers. Advertising agencies built entire campaigns around dyno numbers. Buick needed more. And what they did next changed everything. Engine displacement steadily increased. The 322 gave way to a 364 cubic inch version in 1957 with a 4.125-inch bore and a 3.40-inch stroke. Depending on carburation and compression, output climbed as high as 300 horsepower and over 400 pound-feet of torque. Multiple carburetor setups became available. Twin 4-barrel configurations offered even more muscle. Performance continued climbing. Then came the legendary 401. Introduced for 1959, the 401 cubic inch Nailhead used a 4.1875-inch bore and a 3.64-inch stroke. Compression ratios often hovered around 10.25, one before emissions regulations reduced them later in the decade. Factory ratings reached 325 horsepower and an incredible 445 pound-feet of torque. Those weren't just numbers on paper. In a Buick Electra weighing well over 4,500 pounds, the engine delivered effortless acceleration from idle. Passengers often remarked that the car felt light. It wasn't. The engine was just that strong. Magazine testers consistently praised how the cars barely seemed to notice hills. Highway merging became almost comically easy. Passing maneuvers required barely a flex of the right foot. The transmission often shifted before the engine even reached 4,500 revolutions per minute because there simply wasn't any reason to rev higher. Peak torque arrived around 2,800 revolutions per minute. That's exactly where Buick wanted it. Exactly where drivers spent most of their time. Exactly where smooth, confident acceleration happened. Then came the biggest Nailhead of them all, the 425. Introduced in 1963, displacement reached 425 cubic inches thanks to a 4.3125-inch bore, while retaining the same 3.64-inch stroke. Factory ratings listed 340 horsepower. Torque, a staggering 465 pound-feet. At the time, very few production engines could match it. Cadillac's 429 came close. Chrysler's 413 wedge was in the ballpark. But in terms of sheer relentless low RPM pulling power, the 425 Nailhead stood nearly alone. Many couldn't even come close. Some engineers joked that the 425 didn't accelerate the car, it accelerated the earth underneath it. And drag racers immediately noticed. Unlike many high-revving competitors, the Nailhead launched brutally hard. Its broad torque curve made heavy cars leap off the starting line. In quarter-mile competition, properly tuned Buicks regularly ran in the mid-14-second range straight from the factory. With headers, camshaft upgrades, better carburation, and slick tires, many racers pushed deep into the 12-second zone. Some specialized builds went even quicker. A well-built Nailhead-powered 1965 Skylark could embarrass Chevelles and Impalas at the stoplight Grand Prix. Not bad for an engine people claimed couldn't breathe. Racers discovered something else too. The engine didn't just make power, it made power reliably, weekend after weekend, race after race. But there was another surprise hiding beneath those valve covers. The engine itself was remarkably durable. The forged crankshaft handled punishment well. Deep skirt block construction added rigidity. Massive main bearings survived years of abuse. Buick built these engines tough, really tough. 5 main bearings, each generously sized, supported the forged crank. The block extended well below the crankshaft centerline, adding strength and reducing flex. Thick cylinder walls handled high cylinder pressures without complaint. Transmission failures became far more common than engine failures. One mechanic famously recalled, "We rebuilt Dynaflows. We rarely rebuilt Nailheads." Another said, "I saw Buicks with 200,000 miles on the original engine. Never opened, never leaked, just ran." That kind of durability built customer loyalty. Families bought Buick after Buick, knowing the powertrain would outlast the body. Still, every design carries a price, and eventually, Buick's unique engineering philosophy ran into reality. The same nearly vertical valves that produced incredible low-speed velocity severely limited airflow at higher RPM. Once engine speeds climbed above about 5,000 revolutions per minute, the cylinder heads simply couldn't move enough air. The intake and exhaust ports simply weren't designed for high RPM breathing. Air entering the combustion chamber had to make sharp, nearly 90-degree turns. At low speeds, the high velocity helped cylinder filling. At high speeds, it created turbulence and restriction. Horsepower flattened, then dropped. Rivals began pulling away. Meanwhile, Chevrolet's big blocks, Chrysler's Street Hemi, Ford's FE Series, and Pontiac's high-flow cylinder heads continued improving. Performance escalated year after year. Horsepower figures climbed past 400, then 425, then into the 450-plus range. The Nailhead couldn't keep up without serious modification. Some race-prepared Nailheads tried oversized valves, porting, dual 4-barrel carburetors, aggressive camshafts, and higher compression. Skilled machinists opened up the ports. Valve seats were cut for larger valves. Custom intake manifolds appeared. There were gains, significant gains actually, but the basic architecture remained the bottleneck. Air simply couldn't turn sharply enough into the combustion chamber. The fundamental geometry fought against high RPM airflow. The engine wasn't failing mechanically, it was running into physics, and physics doesn't negotiate. Most people don't realize just how expensive this became. Designing an entirely new cylinder head would have required enormous investment, recasting blocks, new tooling, new machining lines, new assembly processes, new quality control procedures, retraining workers, testing, validation, warranty considerations. The costs quickly spiraled into tens of millions of dollars. General Motors looked at the numbers, then looked at emissions regulations arriving in the late 1960s, then looked at manufacturing costs, then considered that every other GM division was developing newer, more efficient engines. Sharing components across divisions would save money. Unique engines cost money, and the decision became unavoidable. In 1967, Buick introduced an entirely new engine family. The 400 and later 430 cubic inch Buick V8 abandoned the Nailhead architecture altogether. Larger ports, wider valve angles, better breathing, higher horsepower potential, more compatibility with emerging emissions equipment, better fuel economy, lower manufacturing costs. The Nailhead's days were numbered. Production quietly ended after the 1966 model year. No dramatic farewell, no special final edition, no full-page advertisements celebrating its legacy, just silence. One year it powered Buicks, the next year it didn't. It almost seemed as though one of Detroit's most unique engines had been buried alive. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of disappearing, the Nailhead found a second life. Hot rodders loved its compact width. Because the valves stood nearly vertical, the cylinder heads were unusually narrow. That made engine swaps into early Fords surprisingly easy. A Nailhead fit into engine bays where other big blocks simply wouldn't. Model A Fords, 32 three-window coupes, early Willys gassers. The narrow heads were a blessing. Custom builders appreciated another feature. The tall, polished valve covers looked unlike anything else. They stood proud, distinctive, immediately recognizable. Open the hood at a car show today, and a chromed Nailhead immediately attracts attention. Crowds gather, questions start. What engine is that? Is that a Buick? I've never seen valve covers like that. Its appearance alone tells enthusiasts they're looking at something different, something special, something that shouldn't exist in that car but somehow does. Speed equipment companies noticed. Manufacturers like Offenhauser, Edelbrock, Isky, Weyand, and others developed aluminum intake manifolds, multiple carb setups, racing cams, and performance components. The aftermarket grew steadily. Custom headers appeared, high-performance timing sets, roller rockers, aluminum heads for the serious racers. Some drag racers even adapted GMC 671 superchargers onto Nailheads. Boost solved many airflow limitations. Forced induction filled the cylinders regardless of valve size. Suddenly, these engines were producing well over 500 horsepower. Some modern race builds exceed 700. A few highly specialized engines approach 900 horsepower. The engine everyone called outdated suddenly became terrifying again. Collectors noticed too. Original GS models powered by the later Nailheads became highly desirable. Restorers hunted factory dual-quad parts. Rare aluminum components began selling for thousands of dollars. Complete rebuilds often cost well into 5 figures. Not because the engines are complicated, because surviving parts have become increasingly rare. Factory parts were scrapped decades ago. Tooling was destroyed. Patterns were lost. Original equipment components command premium prices. A factory dual 4-barrel intake manifold can sell for over $3,000. Correct carburetor setups easily exceed $2,000. Original air cleaners, brackets, and hardware are worth hundreds. And that's the irony. For decades, enthusiasts laughed at the Nailhead's tiny valves. Today, they treasure them because those strange cylinder heads represent an era when engineers solved problems differently. They weren't chasing dyno charts, they were chasing real-world driving, smoothness, reliability, instant response, massive low-end torque, the kind of power that made sense on American roads. In many ways, Buick built exactly what its customers wanted. The market simply changed faster than the engine could evolve. Then came emissions laws, the Clean Air Act, lower compression ratios, unleaded fuel, insurance surcharges on muscle cars, and tightening federal regulations transformed the American automotive industry almost overnight. Every manufacturer had to adapt. Catalytic converters were coming. Unleaded fuel mandates loomed. Compression ratios dropped. Carburetors gave way to fuel injection. Computer controls replaced mechanical systems. Some legendary engines survived by evolving. Others didn't. The Nailhead became one of the casualties, not because it lacked character, not because it lacked strength, but because engineering priorities had changed forever. The industry moved toward efficiency, emissions compliance, and standardization. Unique designs became liabilities. Shared components became assets. The Nailhead was too specialized to survive. Today, hearing a healthy Nailhead idle is like listening to mechanical history. It has a deep, unmistakable rumble, followed by a wave of torque that arrives almost the instant the throttle opens. It doesn't scream to 7,000 revolutions per minute like a modern performance engine. It doesn't need to. Its personality is completely different. Calm, Confident, effortless. It sounds purposeful, not angry, not frantic, just ready. Blip the throttle and the engine responds immediately, rising and falling with mechanical precision. There's no lag, no hesitation, just instant smooth power delivery. From the driver's seat, the experience is addictive. Plant your foot and the car simply goes. No drama, no wheel spin unless you really provoke it. Just relentless forward motion. That's why enthusiasts still remember it, because numbers only tell part of the story. The real magic wasn't the horsepower rating. It was the feeling of thousands of pounds of American steel moving forward with almost lazy confidence, powered by an engine everyone underestimated. It was passing slower traffic on a two-lane highway without downshifting. It was merging onto the freeway like the car weighed nothing. It was hearing that distinctive valve train clatter at idle and knowing you were driving something special. Buick's Nailhead V8 proved that sometimes the smartest engineering doesn't follow convention. It out-torqued rivals with tiny valves, powered millions of miles of American roads, and earned a reputation that refuses to die decades after production ended. It may have been buried by changing technology, but its legacy still rumbles through hot rods, muscle cars, and garages around the world. The engine that looked backward became a legend looking forward. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Detroit's most misunderstood engines, let me know in the comments which forgotten V8 you'd like to see next. And don't forget to subscribe, because some of the greatest stories in automotive history are the ones almost everyone else forgot.